Okay, good day to you all. This is another session. We're going to talk about investment facilitation for development and then how it's going to be integrated into the system. I'm not going to say anything about that. We have a good panel today. I just want to take this opportunity to welcome some new members of Friends of Multilateralism Group, which has been approved by the board, of course, which will be subject to the confirmation by the General Assembly later on. So I just mentioned the name. Some of them you know already. So it's Jenny Cameron, Ram Edwaria, Dorito Lopez, Hamish McCormick, and Hilda Al-Hine. So their CVs, photos will be on FMG website soon, and we look forward to working with them in the future. So thanks, Petros, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lou. So today we discuss investment facilitation. Super interesting for a number of reasons. It's the first JSI completed. JSI seemed to be the only viable option for WTO to legislate in today's world. And moreover, they got the decision recently to go the Annex 4 way, which has consensus written all over it. And this is quite a decision. I don't know what was the thinking about it. Maybe there were behind the doors negotiations and there is some form of agreement. But no one is better placed to speak about it than Hamid Mamdouh, who's been working on this area for a few years now, has presented a number of papers. I had the pleasure to participate with Hamid in a couple of meetings with our common friend Carl Chauvin at Columbia University on investment facilitation. Without further ado, I open the floor to Hamid, who needs no introduction, but the other two speakers need introduction, so I will introduce Didier Chambovey and Xiankun Lu that most of you don't know. Hamid.
Well, thank you, Petros, for the introduction, and thank you, Lou, for organizing this timely discussion. Now, of course, with the invitation, there were two papers that I did that were circulated on the subject. One was about the legal options, and the other is about provisional application, or the possibility of provisionally applying the agreement. For the first paper, when I went over the different options, but I think most of it now is water under the bridge, because there is this agreement to go the Annex 4 route. There were multiple routes explored in that paper, but there's no point at this stage to get into the full range of options, but simply to look at the route of integrating this agreement into Annex 4 to the WTO agreement. As you know, Annex 4 is only for plurilateral agreements. Plurilateral agreements do not create neither rights nor obligations for non-signatories. Now, what would be the next logical steps after this decision? Normally, in the world of treaty negotiations and treaty building and implementation, the next step for them logically would be to sort of adopt the text of the agreement, in other words, crystallize the outcome in the form of an adopted text of the agreement, which will be treated as the outcome of the negotiations, and then take that text that they have adopted formally. By formally here, I mean among the participants, not among all WTO members. Take that text and submitted to the General Council in an amendment proposal. An amendment pursuant to Article 10 of the WTO agreement, basically participating countries with a list of them proposing the amendment of the WTO agreement by inserting this new investment facilitation agreement into Annex 4 to the Marrakesh Agreement. It's quite similar to what happened with the FTA. There was an amendment protocol that gave effect to the agreement by inserting the trade facilitation agreement into Annex 1A to the WTO agreement. Now here, it will be inserting the agreement to Annex 4. Now, once we go to Article 10 of the WTO agreement and we talk about an amendment, any decision there is going to be taken by consensus, by definition. Now, the differences between different scenarios, therefore, once you're in the sort of amendment shop, as I would call it, and you look for which product you want to pick, you have to keep in mind that on your way out, when you pay, it's going to be a consensus decision. So that takes us from the question of the legal proceedings per se into the political nature of the conversation. Because whether you add it to Annex 1 or Annex 4, there are different legal procedures there involved. But of course, the implications are different, and therefore, the route towards reaching a consensus decision would be different in both. Now, we all know the kind of political difficulties that would be associated with any of those scenarios. But of course, Annex 4 would raise different kinds of questions, like other annexes would. Now here, the conversation about the legal options, which started some time ago, led to some kind of realization regarding the political nature of the conversation associated with GSIs in general, but also in particular with the investment facilitation agreement. And those discussions are very difficult to isolate from other discussions that are taking place about WTO reform. In other words, this whole controversy and this whole discussion about the GSIs and their legal status and whether they're good for the system or not, this is linked to a broader conversation that some members are having about what kind of WTO we want. What would the WTO of the future look like? And therefore, how do we place negotiating projects like that and resulting outcomes into the future context? So basically, part of this political conversation is not to look at the WTO as it is today, but as the WTO that we should have. All this is very good. But then that gave rise to a question about, okay, this agreement is terribly important for developing countries and LDCs who want to start as soon as possible reforming their investment regulations in order to enable them to attract foreign direct investment for obvious reasons. And what if that conversation about integrating the agreement takes a very long time? That gave the idea, actually I mentioned the idea in the first paper about the possibility of provisionally applying the investment facilitation agreement. Now, I was asked to expand on that idea in the second paper, which is the second paper you have, about the implementation of the agreement on a provisional basis. And here I must add that in doing that paper, I was not, and I'm still not advocating taking the route of provisional application, because it's a heavy-duty legal procedure. It's a legal procedure that would require different steps, not only a protocol with the kind of items that you see in the annex there, but also acceptance, in many instances, ratification, and all that. Now, what I'm saying is that it's an option. The objective of making sure that the agreement is implemented as soon as possible is not to deprive developing countries and LDCs of the benefits, particularly benefits relating to the mobilization of resources and establishment of a trust fund and all this, in order to give them technical assistance and capacity building to reform their regulation. Now, if that objective can be achieved, and the donor countries would be happy to put up those resources, in return for a simple gentleman's agreement by developing countries and LDCs to implement, and that the donors would not actually require a legally binding obligation to implement in order to provide the resources, then certainly there would be no need for a heavy legal procedure like provisional application. No need to complicate life if you can make it simple. So just to put that idea of provisional application in context, it's an option only if needed, but not really recommended as the first option. Now, looking at the situation today and back to the scenario about Annex 4, I think we can imagine what kind of pushback that we should expect on Annex 4 in terms of the institutional desirability of adding agreements to that annex. We all know that when the WTO was established, Annex 4 was provided for because there were those agreements that resulted from previous negotiations that pre-existed the WTO, and we needed to find a place for it. But this whole concept of a single undertaking that really guided the architecture of the WTO tolerated Annex 4. But Annex 4 was not seen as a desirable part of the system because of the fragmenting or the perceived fragmenting effect of it. Now, this is history. Again, I go back to what I said. All these things maybe need to be seen in a different context relating to what kind of WTO we want to see, as opposed to what WTO we have now. You know, I've been saying this, one of my sort of favorite phrases to repeat. Let's not focus on the future of the WTO, but let's look at the WTO of the future. And that is, I think, what should inform the kind of choices that come next. Now, I would love to hear what the discussants have to say and get questions from the floor. So I would not expand what I'm saying beyond this, and look forward to the discussion. And thank you. And back to you, Petros.
Thank you, Hamid. Thank you very much. Very clear. The first comment is from Ambassador Didier Chambovey, Ambassador of Switzerland. Herr Botschafter, bitte sehr. Ja.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Petros. And thank you to the Friends of Multilateralism for inviting me to participate in this discussion. That is quite interesting. And I would like to say I've read with great interest the contribution by Hamid. He's setting out the different options, and you have presented those documents, Hamid, very aptly now. So clearly, I mean, 3 points I would like to make at the outset. The plurilateral way, or I would say the open plurilateral way, open plurilateral agreements, they are certainly a very promising avenue for the future. If you look at the big picture, it seems that this is certainly a vehicle that will allow to develop the system in the future that is more promising, perhaps, than other avenues. Secondly, Hamid, you very much underlined the political dimension of the discussion that we have today. Yes, there is a political dimension, and we have to be fully aware of it. There is a legal dimension, but I think the political dimension is really predominant in the debate that we have today. And third, we all know about the controversy on plurilateral initiatives and on whether or not they could be anchored into the system and located under the WTO umbrella. These are the three points. So you set out different options, and in particular, the provisional application option. I would say at this stage, and this is my take, we should privilege the Annex 4 approach, and I will explain why. First of all, the IFD is an agreement that is open to all participants. It's really open plurilateralism. A membership is voluntary. Members are not pressured to join. The agreement is certainly not detrimental to non-participants. It does not impinge on their rights and obligations. It does not do any harm to those who are not participated. And the agreement has been negotiated in full transparency. Any member was able to join. And third, this is an agreement that will apply on an MFN basis. It's clearly spelled out in Article 5 of the IFD agreement. If it is an Annex 4 agreement, it will not, of course, create rights and obligations for non-participants. It means that this commitment to implement the agreement on an MFN basis will not be justiciable or enforceable under the dispute settlement mechanism. Is what it means. But there would be a very strong political commitment from the participant to implement it on an MFN basis. And I think it is an important element, even if it is an Article 4 agreement. What I would like to say now is the political dimension. I believe we have the vehicle. It's Annex 4. It's there. The procedure to add an agreement to Article 4 is rather straightforward. You need a decision by the Ministerial Conference. It's Article 10.9 of the WTO agreement, the agreement establishing the WTO is very straightforward. You do not need this decision to be ratified by 2/3 of the members. But then, of course, for the agreement to be in force, you will have the implementation mechanism of the agreement itself. But I mean, as far as the WTO is concerned, the decision to add an agreement to Annex 4 is quite straightforward. You need a decision by the Ministerial Conference. You need consensus, you're right, Hamid. And now it's really where the political considerations are kicking in. And I would like to underline the nature of the agreement. You've done this, Hamid. First of all, it was an initiative in which a very large number of members participated. More than 100, I think it's 110 members participated. It's more than 2/3 of the membership. And out of those 110 members, you have 77 developing countries and more than 20 least developed countries. The agreement is really intended to assist developing countries in their development efforts, in attracting investment. So this is also a political dimension that is extremely important. And by nature of the provisions of the agreement, it's about procedural requirements, it's about regulatory issues, it's really about facilitation, cutting the red tape, but also creating more transparency and more predictability in the rules. Is typically a global common. It's hard to imagine that such an agreement cannot be implemented on an MFN basis by its very nature. And it's an agreement that would really be beneficial to all members. So I would say you have politically all the ingredients to give it a try, to prepare a decision by the ministerial meeting or by the General Council that is, of course, exercising all the function of the ministerial meeting in the intersessional period, a decision to the effect of adding this agreement to Article 4, to Annex 4, sorry, I'm confusing article and Annex, to Annex 4. The ground would have to be tested, and I think it's going to be a tall order to object to this, due to the nature of the agreement, due to the positive impact that is expected from this agreement for developing countries and the least developed countries in particular. This will require preparations, clearly, very careful preparations. But I think that before looking into other options, and the other options that you have mentioned in your documents, Hamid, are certainly interesting and worth considering. But before looking into this, I think we really have to go through Annex 4. It's much more practical. It will dispel any misunderstanding as to the role of the Secretariat, as to logistical arrangement, and as to the application of the DSU to the new commitments and obligations and rights. So this is my plea. Let's give it a try. If it does not work, then we can turn to other options. But in the first place, in particular at this stage of the negotiation, because the negotiations are finished now in substance, and I think participants are considering now how to move ahead. I'm not any longer, as you know, the permanent representative of Switzerland to WTO, so I'm not aware of all the discussions or the developments. We might have other colleagues who are attending this session who could enlighten us about this. But if I were in their shoes, I would try this Annex 4 avenue.
Thank you very much. So we've had two talks, The Lay of the Land by Hamid and Clearly a Hierarchy of Options by Didier Chambovey. Now the floor is to Dr. Xiankun Lu.
Thank you, Petros. I have only 3 points to make, one comment and 2 questions to Hamid. When I was quite surprised when I read from the WTO website that the IFD participants are going Annex 4. I don't mean that it is the wrong channel. I think Didier made a good point saying that we should try it. But I thought that they would try it in probably a discrete manner, try to see if it works. If not, then we switch to other options instead of making it public. Sometimes probably discrete manner works better than a kind of public thing, which will make things difficult. Anyway, for me, Annex 4 is, of course, an ideal path. If it is succeed, it could create history by creating kind of new model of WTO negotiations, starting from plurilateral, open, and they integrate into the WTO system. I think that's the point. But it may take time, and with a big uncertainty of whether the non-participants would say yes, so that you have a consensus to include it on the Annex 4. So I think that the IFD conveners need to make big efforts and with the non-participants and participate, engage them, persuade them either to join or to join like the 3 new ones, Nigeria, Venezuela, and Tonga. I think that's the 3 names. Or to say yes, they don't join, but they will say yes for Annex 4. I think the 3 biggest questions marks are always with the big 3 guys who are non-participants, the US, India, and South Africa, who are not on board for different reasons. I think that even this is still too early, but I think we should think about, prepare about what to do if it takes too long, or you cannot finally get a consensus. Many of us, including quite some in our group, are in this so-called just do it camp. We are saying that let's just implement it, and with or without Annex 4 or other things. Hamid has also proposed the idea of provisional implementation. I think this is still a kind of a valid issue, even after this announcement of Annex 4 decision. I think that we cannot leave the IFD agreement on the shelf for too long. When it goes beyond its expiry date, then the agreement will be outdated, probably in a few years or even months' time. So here comes to my 2 questions. The first one is about this provisional implementation. I'm not as old as Hamid. I think I would belong to what he said about this young generation, the WTO for the future, whatever. So I don't know exactly what happened in that times, which he mentioned as example for the provisional implementation. But my juvenile imagination is that at that moment, either all contracting parties agreed that they would all do it provisionally, or some say that, okay, we cannot do it, but why don't you guys go ahead, and I'm not going to block you. So then you could set up institutions, everything in the gas system to properly follow up, like Didier said, a kind of logistic setup. But nowadays we are in a totally different situation in the WTO, which is still very different from GATT times. I think some big question marks immediately come to my mind is that if we do it on a provisional basis, could we have a proper institution within the WTO to follow up on transparency, notification, to discuss related issues, or to even dispute, if anything? Or whether you could even set up this fund under the agreement to provide proper technical assistance and capacity building to help the developing countries to implement them. In a word, whether you can use WTO resources or institutions or set up new institutions to implement it and properly follow it. The second question is quite simple. This comes from some of our group members who asked me to pose this question. Why don't we just go ahead with this so-called service scheduling to implement it, to avoid this consensus or headache and other things? I've discussed it with the Hamid, so I know the answer, but I will still pose it so we all hear from him. I'll stop here. Petros, back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a few questions myself, but I first give the floor to participants. Who wants to go first? Hamid, you were in a way asked to respond to a couple of questions. Would you like to first have a first go and then we open it up?
Sure, why not? Well, thank you. I think I will take Lu's questions as they were posed. His first question was about, okay, if you have a provisional application arrangement, basically, this is suggested, as you will see in the paper, as an option provided for by public international law, the law of treaties, the Vienna Convention, which basically provides a possibility for parties to an agreement, those parties who have negotiated an agreement, to implement the agreement provisionally until it definitively enters into force, subject to the kind of stipulations there or constraints they have. In this case, the constraints would be the time it would take to integrate it into the WTO. Now, what happened during the GATT time, and I think this is what Lu was referring to. Although I during the GATT time I still wasn't born, so his point about age actually is not accurate. But what happened then was, when an agreement is implemented provisionally, it is the responsibility of those members who are implementing it. So if we look at this as a possibility now, if there is a protocol provisional application to apply the agreement provisionally, that protocol, that treaty, would be owned by the participants, those who would sign the provisional application protocol. The related institutional arrangements would be their responsibility, because even if the agreement applies legally through that arrangement, it would still not be part of the WTO. It would not be part of the WTO treaty system, nor would it be assumed or presumed that it would be served by the WTO institutional structure. Now, what happened during the GATT was there was something called the ICITO. The ICITO was the Interim Commission for the International Trade Organization. It was an institutional structure that was created for a different purpose. But then when the contracting parties to the GATT decided to implement the agreement on a provisional basis and signed the related protocol, they assigned the ICITO as the institutional body that would administer that agreement. And then, of course, the ICITO hired the GATT secretariat and all that. Now, fast forward to the situation today, if we have a similar kind of PPA or provisional protocol or provisional application, that treaty would be outside the legal scope of the WTO, and therefore related institutional arrangements would have to be agreed to and provided for by parties to the agreement. One cannot, in the world of diplomacy, cannot exclude the possibility that the WTO can provide these kind of services through a different kind of budget. That would be a political question. But what I'm saying is the legal situation would be that it would be outside the scope. Now, the scheduling option that you mentioned, Lou, I think we've gone through that, and it is addressed in the first paper. You can schedule the agreement under the GATS, and the GATS is logical because it covers FDI, and today 2/3 of global FDI flows are in services. And that is arguably covered by Mode 3 in the services agreement. However, whatever you schedule under the GATS would be subject to the overall legal scope of the GATS itself. So what do you do about the non-services FDI part in the investment facilitation agreement? That's why the scheduling option was seen as, yeah, it can work, but it would not cover the entire legal scope of the agreement that is being negotiated. Now, these are the two questions raised. I see there are further hands raised. Back to you, Petros.
Yeah, there are a number of people who request the floor, but first I would like to give the floor to Didier if he wants to add something here.
Thank you. No, not really. Perhaps a very technical issue, Hamid, about the scheduling. You mentioned the possibility of a horizontal exception. And by this, you will cover only the commitments in the area of services. I just try to think about this. Perhaps I'm totally wide of the mark, but I can hardly figure out in today's world a company that does not deliver at the same time a good and a service that is linked to the good, any kind of service. So wouldn't it be a kind of trick, and I use the word trick here, to define, this coverage by a horizontal commitment in the schedule that would, of course, cover services, but it would cover companies delivering all the services that are being listed in the nomenclature, but knowing very well that those companies are certainly, also delivering goods, or sometimes primarily goods. So it would be kind of trick, The beneficiary of the commitment would be the company through the fact that it's also it's not only delivering a good, but also at the same time a service, because I can imagine, and in the modern world, I can hardly figure out any company who is delivering only goods and not services at the same time. I know it's a bit tricky, but perhaps you already have reflected about this.
May I take this?
Of course.
Well, thank you, Didier. This is a very, very interesting question. And it's a question that we have actually addressed way, way back during the banana dispute. And that's why sometimes it's useful to go back to previous cases. The question of what actually the GATS covers. It covers suppliers of services and service suppliers. And it's about trade in services. Now, we came across that question when we were looking at the distribution services in the context of the banana disputes. And we wanted to see whether those banana distributors, the US banana distributors established in the EU, would qualify as suppliers of wholesale services. And the line that was drawn there to see whether they would fall within the scope of the GATS and therefore be entitled to treatment is to see whether those services that are being supplied by those companies are actually in-house services, or is it trade in services? In other words, are they supplying wholesale services to sell only bananas produced by them, and therefore it's just a department in a banana producing company, or are they service suppliers, i.e. engaged in trade and services, supplying the distribution service to bananas produced by other banana producers? Now, it turned out that Chiquita, Dole, and Del Monte, their distribution centers were distributing all sorts of bananas, and therefore they were considered suppliers of distribution services. But if we take services that are supplied in-house in a company, you're right, every company has its own in-house services of all sorts, accountancy, legal, other services. But the line that was drawn through the interpretation of the GATS at the time of the banana dispute was that we see whether the company in question sells its services on the market, or does it have a service producing unit in-house to fulfill its own needs. Now, that of course would I suspect would narrow down the kind of scope we're looking at. Yeah. Back to you, Petros.
4 requests. We start with Alan.
First of all, thank you very much to Hamid and the commentators for this very interesting and informative discussion. The skeptics who were named by, I think, Lu, they're worried about control of the agenda. They're worried about control of resources, which plays out in the budget committee. So a question is, building off of what Didier was saying, for institutionalists, perhaps the most important thing about the IFD is creating a path forward for the WTO. And in the US, we understand dysfunction because our House of Representatives is now emulating the WTO's negotiating function by coming to a complete halt. My question is there a price to be paid to the skeptics on the money part of this, the resources, both the fund, setting up of a fund, which is a sore point for the United States, at least one person in the United States in the budget committee, and not being a precedent for other agreements? Or is it enough to have a consensus approach for Article 4? So the answer is this is not necessarily a precedent, but we want it to be, those of us who favor it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Let me get 4 questions and then I'll give it back to all of you. Gabrielle.
Petros, I suggest you make others and put me last.
Oh, as you want to be last, and the last will be first, said Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Good. I mean, this discussion really highlights the sort of tyranny of consensus. You know, the WTO is often described as suffering from a democratic deficit. Here's an example of a situation where it suffers from a democratic surplus. And, you know, consensus being really a major obstacle to on a very large number of countries, a majority of which are developing countries who want to invest in improving their domestic governance. And yet that is the rule we have. And so why is the rule on the reform agenda of the WTO? I guess that's a fundamental question. And of course, you know, giving up the veto, which is profoundly addictive, is politically probably a non-starter. But we're going to face this issue with every attempt at evolving the rule book of the WTO, of adapting the WTO to new challenges, with a membership that is increasingly fragmented and divided, and where unanimity should not be assumed or expected, simply because collective preferences vary so much. That's my first observation. Second one is, what is the opportunity cost of non-consensus? And you know, here I would say not that great, because investment facilitation is something that literally every country in the world, including developing countries, are already doing. And they're doing this autonomously with the help of organizations like the one I work for, the World Bank. We are heavily involved in helping countries put in place welcoming investment climates and facilitating investment and so on. Of course, it would be unfortunate if all these years of hard work would go for nothing. But I think we have to be realistic here. How much value does this agreement bring to in the grand scheme of things relative to what is already happening? Third question is, how much of this really needs to be subject to dispute settlement? Who's going to take non-compliance with the IFD to dispute settlement? Extremely unlikely in my view. This is essentially an investment in soft law improvements in governance. And then finally is the systemic issue. Didier said the political question is, this is really a political debate. And I think if you look at the debate that surrounded services domestic regulation, it's hard to be terribly optimistic. And of course, those who are skeptical are thinking also about e-commerce. That's the JSI that bothers some countries far more than IFD. But creating a precedent for IFD makes it very difficult then to oppose the incorporation of an e-commerce JSI as an Annex Force agreement. So there is that systemic game being played that I think makes things very complicated. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Pierre. Peter.
Hi, thank you. Quick question to Hamid. If the issue is that some of the investment is for goods, is it an option to attach these new rules to both GATS and GATT commitments?
Thank you. And Gabrielle, and then back to the speakers.
Thank you. So in my personal capacity, of course, a few comments that may call for response. I tend to agree that the Annex 4 is sort of the royal route, if you want. My question and suggestion is that while waiting and continuing to aim for the royal solution, isn't it possible to continue to have also second class, third class sort of approach to confirm changes in practice? So not only declaration of existing members, but maybe even decisions. Traditionally, we don't adopt decisions of the institution unless there's consensus. But what about sort of subgroup decision? Because I believe that state practice in international law is very important. So if you have 60 or 100 in e-commerce countries that develop unilaterally, although in a coordination fashion, a state practice, this has a value in law as such. It's not a new agreement, but it has implications. And on the issue of, can you bring this to dispute? Not formally, but you do have some governments that are whispering now that even for climate change, we could have, for instance, an interpretation decision adopted under this Canadian proposal, DSB1, that allows those who want to have open hearing, for instance, or amicus. In my view, this is strictly or mainly for a procedure, but even if all these things are very imperfect, they are still important in terms of politics to confirm a change. And since this agreement does not include anything illegal if it's done unilaterally, well, it's still wonderful if 64 do it, whether it's pursuant to the agreement formally or as a choice, as it was mentioned, the World Bank and other institutions favor that. On the issue of schedule, it's far from perfect. May I advise that these agreements be in goods and services schedule. It is imperfect, but remember that in trade facilitation, when India was difficult, the threat of passing the trade facilitation through schedule was serious enough to involve even some countries to talk about it. And I'm not saying this is what made India change, but it could be part of an overall approach. And on the goods and services, you're all aware of this new paper of the OECD saying that even this distinction of goods and services is outdated for today. We should all revise it. So what about having the agreement attached not necessarily only to services or goods, but a bit like Australia did with the head note issue, attach it to the cover of the commitments of the member. My overall comment is that I think governments should continue to aim for the royal solution of Annex 4 clearly, and those provisional implementation outside that some people initially considered. they're not good because ultimately they want it inside. So let's do second and third best alternatives while continuing to push for more. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. I go back to Hamid first and then to Didier and Lu.
Well, thank you. I think the consensus is inevitable. I'm just commenting on what Pierre said. I think we do have a problem with the way consensus is being practiced. I don't think the problem is with the concept itself, but it's with the abuse of consensus. But that's another conversation. Regarding scheduling, I think there are two parts to that question. There's what Peter raised regarding the GATT. I think when I mentioned the scope of the respective agreements, the GATT and the GATTs, the scope of the GATT is more focused on the treatment of products crossing borders. Now, it does not extend at a primary level to cover the producers unless the measure relating to the producers affect the competitive position of the product itself. Now, that makes the coverage under the GATT a bit ambiguous, to say the best. Now, with respect to the GATTs and services, I agree with Gabriel. We discussed extensively during the trade facilitation agreement legal proceedings that, yes, all the obligations under the trade facilitation agreement could actually fit within the scope of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That was a critical gateway question that we discussed within the Secretariat for a few months. And the agreement was, yes, there is nothing, there are no constraints there with respect to the legal scope of the GATT itself. Now, you can actually pursue the scheduling approach as maybe an interim or a less than optimal solution, as Gabriel suggested. Yes, you could do that, but I think the current situation now would suggest that if you really want to go down that road, then perhaps you should pay attention to the domestic regulation scheduling as what I would consider the most straightforward case of scheduling improvements to existing commitments. It's a much simpler conversation that should be had about improving schedules, yet it is quite obstructed. So I think the long and short of what I'm saying is that, yes, you can, there are so many creative legal solutions, but I think we come back to square one, which is the political situation and how do we move this forward within sort of a broader conversation, and how long would it take, and in the meantime, what should we do? So back to you, Petros.
And back to Didier.
No, thank you very much. Just a couple of remarks. Pierre, I would agree with you. I mean, that we do not need a sophisticated dispute settlement mechanism to deal with this kind of obligations that we have in the IFD agreement. I would have thought of a kind of mediation mechanism, but I mean, it seems that the participants in the initiative, they took another way, and we have to find a way to operationalize, I would say, what is in the agreement. And it's also one of the reasons why I'm mentioning Annex 4. And you made a very good point, Pierre, about why it would be difficult to have a consensus on incorporating the IFD agreement into Annex 4. But nevertheless, and I agree here with Gabrielle, she said it's the royal way. I agree with this. It has to be tested. With the commitments, the scheduling approach to the domestic regulation, we have not tested Annex 4. We have a different approach. It's through scheduling that the commitments are incorporated into the system. Here, we have the opportunity to see whether Annex 4 is an avenue for a very specific agreement, I would like to say. And we have to consider the nature of the agreement. And this is all this political dimension that has to play out. And it's important for the participant to make the point here when and if they choose to prepare a decision for the ministerial conference or for the General Council to the effect of incorporating the agreement into Annex 4. Really, we have to find, and I agree with Alan, and Alan, congratulations on your book. I had the opportunity to read it, part of it. It's quite a thick book, so I have not read all the book, but congratulations in particular. You have some interesting consideration about the future of the system, and we need to find ways that are stable and predictable in order to incorporate the outcome of plurilateral negotiations under the umbrella of the WTO. We have a logistic, we have a machinery, and I believe it would be only natural that agreements such as the IFD, that is beneficial to the system, that is beneficial to all members, would find a place in this machinery. And really, this is what has to be tested here. That's the reason why I'm making this plea, but I'm not ruling out clearly other options. Clearly, we may need to reflect about this, but at this moment, it's perhaps not time to flare up those options. I think we have to focus on Annex 4.
Lou?
Thanks, Petros. I just have two quick points to add. And first one is about what Gabriel said about this kind of is right to try this royal route of Annex 4, but it should also prepare other things. So which simply, in my word, would be let's go high, but let's prepare low. So while trying the Annex 4 consensus, but we also need to prepare how we could do it just in case that that road doesn't open. We should consider whether we do it in the WTO or outside of the WTO, one way or the other. We do have some other examples which are already in place. I mean, you all know this DPR on digital service, digital trade with Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. I think they didn't wait until the e-commerce negotiation in WTO to finish and start doing something. They're already there, setting on their DPR framework, and we got China, I think UK and some others are already applying to join. So that could be a kind of a catalyst to implement things while not so as not to wait for long. And probably IFD is even better than DPR and some others. Is that as we are just discussing now, is that it's better because Didier said that we have over 70 developing countries, we have over 20 LDCs all in it, and we have a few more just joined. So and also the IFD has a very strong pillar on development, focusing on specific concerns of developing countries and LDCs. So I think even outside of the WTO, it just a basic means to avoid the complexity of the WTO consensus or Annex 4 thing if it doesn't work, but not in a way to dilute the WTO work or the importance of the system, or just to shy away from the WTO to undermine it. I don't think so. The other point, very simply, is that if you look at carefully the IFD agreement, you will see that it's very much soft law based in Denver, transparency, streamlining procedures. Those has a value, but those are not enough for the ongoing kind of billions of US dollars going around the world on a minute basis. So I think that the IFD participants should already be preparing for the next step to further improve it, add to it, make it stronger, make it less soft, and so on and so forth. I think that would keep the initiative more alive and also more attractive to those non-participants, and hopefully sooner or later they will join the IFD, and which naturally could bring it back to the WTO as a multilateral agreement. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go any further, Lou, until what time can we go? Because maybe in function of your guidance, I will open the floor for more or less questions.
Yeah, no, we usually do 1 hour and a half, so we have still over 30 minutes to go.
Excellent. Now, the next question comes from Dr. Locatelli. We cannot hear you. You're muted.
Hello, yes. Hi, Petros. Hi, Hamid. And actually, thank you for calling me doctor, but I'm not a doctor, Petros. But
I can see into the future. I have psychic powers.
Okay, great. Thank you. Look, I'm posing this question really basically on my own behalf, not representing the institution I'm working for. And I wanted to bounce back on the question posed by Alan Walden. Thank you for the question. Because Alan, if I understand correctly, you were asking, because it is certainly an important part of the equation. It's the budget. It's how to pay for this technical assistance and for all the infrastructure to actually put the IFD in place. And of course, as long as it is not an WTO agreement, normally WTO secretariat cannot be used. Including ourselves, by the way. And we know there's a battle shaping up at the CBFA. So in fact, I wanted to return the question to you because I'm sure that you have some ideas in your mind. But when you were saying, what the price could be, what price could be paid to the septics on the money side, what to put in place in terms of resources, what did you have? Did you have any ideas in mind? What could be potentially, conceived in that? And I know it's part of this political equation, and I think that will be an important point. Thank you.
Alan, the question is back to you.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think the precedent is extraordinarily important here, and no commitments should be made to diminish the full nature of this coming into the WTO, which is going to be a royal battle. But this is the best one, I think, as Lou and Didier and others and Hamid have said. This is the best ground on which to fight the battle. To change the WTO to move it forward, because so many developing countries and least developed are involved. This has, it's a plus and a minus from a U.S. point of view, no doubt, that China is a major supporter, but be that as it may, the future of the WTO rests upon this going forward. Now, it may be that it has to be provisional application or sort of the workarounds that Hamid is a master at. And, the whole GATT, it seems to me, was, the whole GATT secretariat was of questionable legal status for 50 years. So, we can live with creative solutions, but this has to be, to the extent possible, a part of the WTO, and it can't become a second bite at the apple in the CBFA constantly. So it's going to be a major issue, and the United States is on the wrong side of this particular one, which is unfortunate.
If I don't abuse my chair privilege, I have a question for my ambassador, Dr. Chambovey. You mentioned before, I don't know if I overshoot your argument, but correct me if you think I do so. You said there are two JSIs for now, the two that you mentioned, domestic regulation and IFD. And you said in one of them, we considered one option for implementation. In the other, let's consider a different one. Now, is this, in your view, the way WTO membership should approach JSIs with flexibility? Should there be one template for all? Should we distinguish? And if we do, what should be the criteria for, if I understand correctly, your optimism is due to the fact that now you have 110 members behind the IFD, and many from all straight of the WTO, from LDCs to OECD members. Can you please elaborate a bit on this point?
Petros, thank you very much. I mean, one size fits all. I mean, it would be ideal if we had something like this. And my impression is WTO members are dealing with this question of integrating the outcome of plurilateral initiatives into the system on a case-by-case basis. With domestic regulation, we had this GATS approach, the scheduling approach. We know it's sputtering, but it's not the end of the road. I don't know exactly where we're standing, but there are possibility to go to arbitration, you know, in order to finalize this incorporation. It seems if I listen to Hamid, and Hamid is certainly the best expert in this area, that the scheduling approach is not feasible in the case of the IFD. And if not, my impression is that members, they are looking for other ways. In this case, I would say it's reasonable to go for Annex 4. Of course, Hamid, you're right to say that Annex 4 was meant to find a place for the leftovers of the previous negotiations for those plurilateral agreements. But nevertheless, Annex 4 is there. You have provisions in the agreement establishing the WTO about what Annex 4 is doing and is not doing as well. And it seems to be suited for this kind of agreement, IFD. But Petros, I think we will have to cross that bridge when the negotiation on e-commerce are finished, because they are of a completely different nature. If you look at the level of ambition, what it means, and in particular the impact it can have on the ground. So the question of integration will arise again and will be even more thorny than it is now with the agreement on IFD and also the domestic regulation agreement. And perhaps at this moment, we will have to be creative. Perhaps we will have to find a way and to find a vehicle that may be useful for all future plurilateral arrangements. And I'm just seizing the opportunity, if you allow, because Alan is online. Alan, in your book, you write, basically, if I'm not mistaken, just do it. Let's be pragmatic. Just do it. And if the agreement is really in the interest of the multilateral trading system, it goes without saying that the Secretariat and the Director General will have to provide the appropriate support. I don't know whether you could elaborate a little bit on this and how you reached this conclusion that the machinery will be available for an agreement that has been concluded among a group of members or subgroup of members, for instance, and who would like simply to assert themselves and to say, look, this belongs to the WTO system and has to be serviced by the Secretariat. It may be one way, and it's perhaps the way that we may go if we use this provisional application vehicle.
Alan, sorry for this, back to you and then to Hamid.
Yeah, my feeling is that the bravest thing in the second term of Azevedo that he did was to say to any objector that these JSIs want to meet. I'll give them Secretariat support. It's consistent with the WTO and my mandate to serve the WTO, so I'm just doing it. And there was no vote. There was no ability to vote because there was nothing on the table to vote for or against. No veto. may have gone so far in the book, I think I did, to say if the members of RCEP or CPTPP or the African Continental Free Trade Agreement said, we really like the WTO to be our secretariat. And it was determined, this is the extreme case, but it was determined that, look, all of Africa would be benefited by this expertise in the secretariat. And by the way, they're paying, so it's not before the budget committee, that in the extreme case, some years from now, the WTO becomes, in fact, the World Trade Organization. Anything can be docked there that is consistent with the objectives of the stepping stones to the agreement. And plurilaterals are the first step. So I would have, Pierre has talked about the tyranny of the veto, get past the tyranny of the veto on negotiation, and similarly, the negative consensus in the DSB that takes members' control of dispute settlement completely away. There are two vetoes that are too extreme, one negative, one positive. So yeah, I would go ahead. I think this is the one to do it on because of the degree of support. But that, you know, if Hamid is very good at sort of what are all the options to work within the system, first try all the options to work within the system and then just do it.
Hamid.
Well, thank you. I'll take from where Alan left. I mean, I agree with everything he said. I think I remember we discussed this about a couple of years ago. I did another paper 2 years ago about WTO rules on plurilateral negotiations and plurilateral outcomes. And I thought one of the important things that we need to make a distinction of in this conversation about GSIs and plurilaterals is to separate negotiations from outcomes. When it comes to negotiations, there are no consensus requirements in the WTO. There's no requirement that a subset of members, when they initiate a plurilateral negotiation, that they have to get everybody's approval. It doesn't exist. The example there to look at is the ITA. The ITA was launched, conducted, concluded, and entered into force without a single consensus decision. And these sort of plurilateral negotiations have been a common practice in the system for the past 70 years. Now, when it comes to outcomes, the situation is different, and it depends on the type of the outcome. And here, I would say it will be very difficult to actually have a one-size-fits-all for that, because Article 10 of the WTO agreement specifies the procedures that you need to follow if you have a new standalone agreement. And then the GATT and the GATS specify the scheduling certification procedures if you want to change your schedules. And changing your schedule by withdrawing commitments, of course, has different procedures from adding to your schedules. Adding to your schedules does not involve the same kind of negotiation for compensatory adjustment and all that. So let's separate looking at negotiations from outcomes. And when it comes to negotiations, these are WTO negotiations. And as Alan said, when Azevedo said, sorry, these are WTO negotiations, and the Secretariat has to service them, that was actually backed up by our constitution, the WTO agreement itself. But when it comes to outcomes and administering outcomes, I think the question here becomes different. And it would become a question of whether that outcome is part of the treaty system in the WTO for which the institutional structure of the WTO was created to service or not. And that links to the discussions about budget. Now, what Alan said also is quite important in terms of why the skeptics are pushing back. Because, of course, they care about resources, but I think what they care more about is the control over the agenda. That, I think, is the most critical hurdle, most critical issue here. It has direct implications for the future of the system and what kind of a system we want to have for that future. And here, of course, as I said, JSI outcomes are apples and oranges. Domestic regulation is a straightforward case under the GATS, but this one is different. And investment facilitation is different in more than one way, not just in the sense that it is a new standalone agreement, but also in the sense that it covers an area that was never covered by any WTO agreement before, which is non-services FDI. And that actually creates an issue that the skeptics refer to on several occasions, saying, well, we haven't agreed to bring investment into WTO. Now, this is in part, among other things, what links the conversation here about the IFDA to the broader political conversation that needs to take place at a very high political level, but also to be anchored in solid, substantive details. What kind of a system do we have? And looking into the future, and looking at the IFDA today with the number of developing countries and LDCs, you can immediately see that a future WTO would have to take into account the diversity in the membership and therefore provide for more options, for more solutions. Annex 4, when I refer to the history of Annex 4, I'm not against Annex 4. I'm saying this is where it came from. And maybe we need to look at Annex 4 in a way that is more commensurate with the world we're living in today, the diversity of membership, and therefore we need more variable geometry in the system. The system as it is not working. So I agree, we need to look at Annex 4 in a more positive light. And maybe we need to look at more creative solutions as well. I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned in the paper the first paper that you have before you is about, if members if the participants want to create rights for non-signatories, then you can even create a new annex. The legal solutions are not going to be the problem here. We can think creatively. The real problem is to agree on a political vision about the WTO of the future. What kind of WTO do we want? And Alan's book has a lot of good ideas on that. So I think that's all I have for now. Back to you, Petros.
Excellent. I have no more questions. Oh.
I just want to follow up on this kind of finding creative ideas, and also what Alan Hamid have been talking about, this control of the agenda, which I agree. My sense, probably a little bit different, is that this means not only the ongoing agenda or future agenda, but also the agenda with items from previous the items of previous agenda, which are important for some members who are not participating. I mean, Peter has just recently written about fisheries, agriculture, and so on and so forth. And we have also developed countries. I was reading the UNCTAD report, and they are still quite a focus on these so-called implementation issues, 150 or so, and also market access of interest to developing countries, the DSP and availability reciprocation. So, I mean, this would mean that also, while going along to push for FD for its implementation, whatever, which is extremely important, but also need not to look at the broader context of this ongoing WTO reform. We have a mandate, but what to do next? So probably some of these other issues need to come up so as to kind of balance a little bit the package of potential future reform the elements that would help create ease down kind of tension and give people more confidence that, okay, we're doing this, but we're not forgetting other things. But of course, I'm just saying it. I know this is a daunting task to pursue different things, but I think with the mandate and with the incoming MC13, I think those are things the minister should be seriously thinking about. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks, Petros.
Thank you very much. Hamid has a response to you, though. You ignite fire here.
A follow-up. Thank you, Petros. A follow-up. I think Lou raised a very important point about the negotiating agenda, and that reminds me really of the need within any reform discussion to look not only at the negotiating agenda and the items, but to look at the institutional challenges facing the negotiating function. Because we keep asking for outcomes from a machine that is broken, the negotiating machinery itself, and the institutional challenges that are holding back the negotiating function I'm talking about are things about how do you apply special and differential treatment in an effective way, but a way that actually moves us forward. There has been a lot of work on that. I did some in the past. Patrick Lowe did more work on it. We've been discussing it, but the disagreement on how the mechanism of special and differential treatment actually should be applied in today's world of diverse membership is holding back the negotiating function. The other point is, how do we clarify? We need to clarify the rules on plurilateral negotiations, because as you have seen from the discussion today, a lot of what is holding us back is, disagreement on the fundamentals here. We disagree on how the machinery actually applies. The other thing that is holding back the negotiating function is capacity building for developing countries and LDCs, for God's sake. All the capacity building that are being provided are being provided for implementation. But rarely do we see serious capacity building resources and efforts being directed to help developing countries negotiate, appreciate the negotiating propositions that they're facing and engage in negotiations. And what you get as a result is blockages. So this is just a follow-up on what Lou said. Thank you.
Thank you. I see no more hands raised, unless if someone wants to take the floor. No one? Oh, Alan.
One brief point, and that is to what Hamid just said. Though the exception to no capacity building assistance with respect to negotiation is accessions, and maybe the rest of the institution could learn from accessions.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, I think this was a very fruitful discussion. I suggest we give it up for Hamid Mamdouh, Didier Chambovey, and Lou.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you in the next event. Lou, I must say your timing for this one was amazing. You picked the day without knowing they would go down the Annex 4 route, which they did, and they made it super topical.
No, thanks to you, Petros, for the collaboration. It was me and Hamid, we brewed upon this date, and we didn't expect this to happen. But it
exactly. I mean, this was manna from above.
Yeah. Thank you all.
All the best.
See you next time. Thank you.
See you next time. Bye-bye.